Resuming debate, Senator Plett.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Colleagues, I also rise today to speak briefly to Bill C-24, an act to amend the Employment Insurance Act, additional regular benefits, the Canada Recovery Benefits Act, restriction on eligibility, and another act in response to COVID-19. I would like to first of all thank Senator Lebakine-Benson and my colleague Senator Poirier for their work both as a sponsor and the critic of this bill. And as Senator Poirier pointed out in her speech, we will be supporting this legislation. We have to support this legislation. It is needed by Canadians. We have always supported getting help to those who have been hit hard by the pandemic. What we do not support, however, is this government's incompetence. It was pointed out to us very clearly in my friend Senator Housakis' speech on C-18 about some of the mishandling of legislation, and we have seen it here again with Bill C-24. We have seen time and time again how bills are introduced at the 11th hour and then rushed through the legislative process as parliamentarians scramble to make up for precious time that the government has lost with unnecessary delays, legislative rewrites, and procedural fumbles. Consider, for example, colleagues, the portion of this bill which amends the Canada Recovery Benefits Act. These amendments close a loophole which stems from a policy announced over 7 months ago. It was August 20th when the government announced last year that they would be creating the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit. The only problem was that the Prime Minister had already prorogued Parliament 2 days before the announcement, and it was not scheduled to be recalled for another 5 weeks. Even though the government knew for a month that the SIR program was winding down, on September 26th, they took no legislative action to fill the gap that would be left until February 24th, 2 days before the deadline. Sound familiar? When they introduced Bill C-2, an act relating to economic recovery in response to COVID-19. You will recall, Senators, that this bill was going to implement the Canada Recovery Benefit and the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit. Knowing that the timetable was tight, the Conservative opposition offered to work through the weekend to get the bill passed. Similar to what they did with Bill C-7. They offered to work through the weekend. They were turned down and then accused of filibustering when they hadn't even started debate. The government refused here and instead decided to go home. Then 4 days later, on September 28th, the government abandoned Bill C-2 entirely and started the legislative process over with Bill C-4, an act relating to certain measures in response to COVID-19. Now, it was Bill C-4 that would implement the new programs, including the flawed Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit. And the government proceeded to rush the bill through every stage in the House of Commons in 1 single day. Because the government had decided to take 5 weeks off and prorogue Parliament for no good reason, well, I guess the Prime Minister thought there was a good reason. He wanted to avoid some scandal issues. The Senate was left with little choice but to expedite the process as well. We received the bill the following day, Wednesday, September 30th, and had it out the door 2 days later on Friday, October 2nd. It would be another 3 months, colleagues, before Minister Qualtrough finally acknowledged that there was a serious problem with the legislation. It allowed people who were quarantining after a holiday to apply for the benefit. But by this time, the government had already processed 450,000 applications for the CRSB. 3 weeks later, on January 20th, the government circulated draft legislation to fix the loophole. But that legislation was never tabled. Instead, they waited another 5 weeks until February 25th, and then tabled the bill before us today, Bill C-24, which would finally close the loophole along with increasing EI coverage for those impacted by COVID-19. But since February 25th was a Thursday before a break week, Bill C-24 wouldn't see second reading until 11 days later on March 8th, 2021. March 8th was 201 days since the government had first announced the CRSB program. And on March 8th, after taking 201 days to address their mistake, Minister Qualtrough released an open letter to Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole urging him to support the government's plan to rush the bill through all of its legislative hoops. It was a crass political move by the government, designed to try and shift attention away from their disastrous handling of the legislative agenda and paint the opposition as responsible for delays. Later that day, the bill was debated for a total of 2.5 hours. 3 days later, on March 11th, it was debated for another 3 hours. It then went to the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills, and Social Development, which reported back to the House without amendments on the same day. The following day, on March 12th, the bill passed by the House of Commons. This means that from the day the new programs were announced by the government to the day that they realized they had created a gaping hole, 136 days had passed. It then took another 55 days for them to table legislation to fix the problem. That's 191 days from when the government created the problem to when Parliament was presented with a plan to fix it. 191 days. It then took only 3 sitting days for the House of Commons to pass the bill. And we plan to pass it here in this House in the same amount of time. Of course, the government spread those 3 sitting days over more than 2 weeks. But given how poorly they manage the legislative agenda, that shouldn't surprise anyone. Colleagues, in the midst of the greatest health and economic crisis to hit this country in over 100 years, this government has exhibited a disturbing pattern of incompetence. With a few variations, the pattern usually unfolds along these lines. Number 1, the government dawdles until the 11th hour, then rushes to introduce legislation. 2, they breathlessly note that time is short and demand that the bill must be hurried through Parliament without allowing time for proper examination and debate. 3, when the opposition tries to point out that proper scrutiny of the legislation will help ensure we don't experience further delays and unexpected surprises, the government blames the opposition for holding things up. 4, after the bill is passed, the government reluctantly admits that it contains errors and must now be fixed. 5, they take more time to draft the amendments to fix the errors than they took to write the original legislation. 6, they eventually get around to introducing the amending legislation and make the changes retroactive in order to mop up the mess they created. 7, they insist that Parliament must now rush this amending legislation through because the clock is once again running down. And number 8, they return to step 1 and repeat the process for any additional legislation that is required. But colleagues, not all of this can be chalked up to incompetence. Some of it appears to be the government's willingness to put its political interests ahead of the people of Canada, even in the midst of a pandemic, rather than admitting to and fixing its mistakes in a timely manner. this government chooses to wait until it can bury its amendments in a larger bill. Consider the fact that with the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit, they had legislation ready to go on January 20th. Yet they chose to wait until they could distract the public from their error in packaging it in a bill which would include additional COVID support measures. Furthermore, I would remind you that we are still waiting for the promised fix to the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy. You may recall that Bill C-9 was written in such a way that it required business owners to pay their rent before they would qualify for the rent subsidy. If a business cannot pay their rent because of COVID-19, they can apply for the rent subsidy, but only after they pay their rent. The government promised to correct this little problem, but as of today, the law remains as it was passed by Parliament on November 19th of last year. Instead of doing its job properly, the minister shrugged and instructed Canada Revenue Agency to ignore the law because they would eventually get around to correcting it. And eventually they did. The fix is now buried in Clause 4 of Bill C-14. It is a total of 160 words. So why did the government not introduce a simple 160-word bill to correct this problem, rather than choosing to wait more than 4 months to bury it in a bill of over 2,500 words, which has nothing to do with the rent subsidy? It is difficult to know whether the answer to that question is political opportunism or incompetence. But either way, it does not serve the people of Canada well. Colleagues, this last year has been a very difficult one for most Canadians. As I said earlier, Conservatives strongly support getting help to those who have been hit hard by the pandemic and the government's mishandling of it. But we do not support this government's incompetence and blatant self-interest in the midst of a global pandemic. We will be supporting this legislation, but regret that the government has repeatedly failed to provide much-needed support to Canadians in a timely manner. Thank you, colleagues.